Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We are recording on Tuesday, the 18th of February, and we apologise for the fact that we missed a week last week. Unfortunately, we couldn't manage to fit it in, but we're back this week with a bumper episode. So, how's it going, Jen?
Hey, great. Lots happening, lots to talk about. Pretty pleased to see that our last episode got a lot of views and shares. So I would encourage, if you're listening and you like this, to share it. If you don't like it, then don't. That's fine. But that would be great. But no, lots happening. I had a piece out in Aspie's The Strategist recently. Really, it was a response to a piece that was arguing that we should replace the plan for frigates with missile attack boats. So my piece was talking about why that capability is not appropriate from Australia, and less from a capability comparison piece, which is fairly easy to do, but more from what does a maritime strategy look like for Australia, and what are some of the attributes that we need, right? And two of those key attributes are the idea of reach, so the ability to operate far from our coast, and also the idea of a balanced fleet. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a cross, promotion. There will be a podcast coming out, maybe before this one, with myself and Steve Cooper on Defence Connect, really exploring what those ideas of reach and balance mean for Australia's Navy. Also, I was, and again, cross-promotion, on an ABC podcast that came out in the last week that I would commend to you if you're interested in it, on AUKUS. So it was with the global roaming team, so Hamish McDonald and Geraldine Doogue. And it was myself and ex-Senator Rex Patrick discussing audience questions on AUKUS. So it was really interesting. And the feedback I've had is it was good, but people might be being kind. But anyway, listen to that. We can probably put a link to that in the show notes. So that's really what's been happening with me. What's been happening with you, Richard?
I've not been recording more podcasts than I can shake a stick at, if that's what you mean. People could spend their entire time just listening to you on your varying different podcasts.
They absolutely should, or not. My wife gets sick of my voice as well. But anyway,
I was down in Sydney at an AUKUS conference last week, which was one of the reasons why we didn't get to record the podcast. But that was interesting, particularly hearing some of the industry perspectives and sort of American and UK perspectives on that. So that was very interesting, and particularly as to perhaps put it this way, we live in interesting times, and so trying to sort of unpick some of the dynamics and the political, but also the industrial elements of that. But as we've said, we've got lots on, so we're going to crack on. What has been happening in the region over the past week to 10 days?
Well, lots, and including in the world, but we'll keep this to maritime issues. I guess talking about some of the things, we have some reporting in Australia from Australian media and also from Chinese media about an incident last week between an Australian P-8 and a Chinese fighter jet. So there is a Department of Defence of Australia release on it that calls the interaction over the South China Sea as unsafe and unprofessional. It looks like the Chinese fighter jet got within 30 metres of the Australian P-8 and deployed flares. Now, exactly where in the South China Sea, it's not clear. There was a Chinese state media release that talked about this being in the vicinity of the Paracel Islands. But look, we're just seeing more of that continued aggression from the PLA. This isn't new. There was an incident in 2022 that involved chaff as opposed to flares with a Chinese fighter and Australian P-8. So this is part of what we know now is kind of a consistent policy within the PLA Air Force and Navy of, if not directing, then certainly encouraging this kind of aggression towards not just Australian assets, really any assets they view as external, so not coastal states of the South China Sea, obviously parking the Philippines conversation right now. Kind of linked to that, and on the same day, we saw a release from the Australian Department of Defence talking about a Chinese task group or surface action group that was operating in the Coral Sea. Again, interesting that they were released on the same day. I think there's a clear message there of, we expect you, China, to act in accordance with international law in the South China Sea, and we accept that you have the right to operate in our exclusive economic zone as per UNCLOS. So I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. It certainly got a lot of reporting in the media. What was your take on those two releases and events?
Yeah, so I thought the P8 incident is interesting, and as you say, it's always this question about how much do we read into it? Is this official Chinese kind of policy? It came within a day or so of another of these multilateral maritime cooperative activities, MMCAs. I know how much you love that term.
Great.
Which
makes
was
a lot of sense.
Undertaken by sort of had Australian, Philippine, Japanese, and US involvement. And so the Chinese have clearly been trying to push back on these efforts by these countries to sort of have a multilateral presence in the South China Sea and push back on Chinese aggression there. And so whether or not this is a kind of an official or even a kind of an officially sanctioned effort to try and sort of push back on this, saying you're an outsider, you don't belong in this area, or is it something that's more kind of individualistic? It's really hard to tell, but it certainly fits into that kind of pattern. And the fact that it comes, as I say, merely a day or so afterwards, did seem to perhaps suggest that there's something there. In terms of the Chinese vessels in the Coral Sea, I think first and foremost, we ought to, as you've said, highlight that they're operating in the Australian Exclusive Economic Zone. That is not something that is in any way against international law. That is perfectly acceptable. We do it to other countries. Places like the United States do it to countries all the time, all over the world. So we ought to acknowledge that. And I think there were some kind of calls from certain commentators and in elements of the press sort of suggesting that this was somehow China encroaching on Australian territory or anything like this. It is not. So that's really important. What I think is notable, though, is the degree to which you are seeing PLAN vessels, and not merely any old PLAN vessels. These are really capable platforms, particularly the Renhai class cruisers, Type 55s. These are very, very capable warships operating now very much within Australia's immediate region. And this is relatively new, and it's something that I suspect you're going to see a lot more of into the future. And so I think that's what the story is here, much more than the kind of they're doing something bad type narrative. That would be my kind of take.
Yeah. I agree with you. It was amazing to see some of the, I got to be honest, some of the questions I was asked by journalists, like, is Australia being invaded? The answer is no. But look, I mean, it is an interesting element that China actually disagrees with the right of warships to operate in other countries' EEZ. Just a segue. UNCLOS is pretty clear on the point, but China, like some other Asian countries, to be honest, it's not just China. There are other countries, predominantly in Asia, who take that view. But look, I completely agree with your sentiment. But it is clear, going back to what would happen. Certainly Australia is not going to be invaded, and we're not at war. But I think it just show, China's reach and their ability to operate in our region. And if we did reach a crisis, or God forbid a conflict, their ability to interfere with our seaborne supply, right, which is a constant conversation we talk about. But anyway, on that depressing note, what else going on in the region?
So we've seen HMAS Hobart continuing its regional presence deployment. It is currently in Indonesia, in Bali, taking part in the International Fleet Review, which will celebrate the 80th anniversary of the formation of the Indonesian Navy, and will then go on to take part in Exercise Komodo, which is an Indonesian-led exercise. This year, it's focusing on collaborative maritime search and rescue, and it's a quite a large multilateral kind of exercise. So this is very much part of the kind of regular Royal Australian Navy regional presence deployments and engaging with, in this case, our nearest neighbour. So that's kind of a pretty consistent story that's as I say, we talk about quite a lot. What do you make of what's going on at the moment in terms of HMS Hobart's deployment?
Look, I think, Hobart, certainly from a regional engagement perspective, looks to have had a pretty successful deployment. Obviously, we spoke in the last episode about their participation in La Perouse. They've obviously participated in the multilateral maritime cooperative activity. They've done a bunch of things. Worth noting that although Indonesia actually does do international fleet reviews quite commonly, I'm not sure about whether maybe it's every couple of years. This is actually the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the Indonesian Navy, which is worth remarking on. But back to Komodo, look, I think it's great. I do wonder if Hobart is the largest vessel we've ever sent to participate in Komodo. Komodo is a large Indonesian multinational exercise, but it tends to be smaller vessels that participate, as you mentioned before, focused on maritime search and rescue. And that's a common theme in Southeast Asia. So there is a reluctance to collaborate on any kind of exercise that might be interpreted as high-end warfare. Particularly because of China's responses to some of the multilateral maritime cooperative activities, etc. So it is common to use the term maritime search and rescue as a focus for the exercise. I don't know what it actually involves. It's probably got a few officer watch manoeuvres and things like that. But there is a clear trend there in terms of how Southeast Asian countries label these exercises.
Excellent. So what else has been going on? One of the things is there's been some announcements around sort of continued developments in terms of AUKUS Pillar 2. In particular, the RAN has deployed a team to join USN and Royal Navy as part of a subsea and seabed warfare exercise, which is currently taking place in Norfolk, Virginia. This is kind of in many ways deeply unsurprising. All of a sudden, you can barely open the ABC news app without seeing some article or other with somebody called Jen Parker quoted talking about cables or subsea pipelines or other maritime critical infrastructure and the threats that there are to this. This is clearly an area of huge focus at the moment, and I think everyone will accept that there's currently more questions than there are answers, but equally most people acknowledge that some form of autonomous technology is going to be a key part of the solution to these kind of problems. So it's quite clear that this is an area where AUKUS Pillar 2 can add value, and it seems that they're sort of quite what they're describing as a complex integrated subsea warfare exercise taking place, and the RAN is involved in this. Whether or not this is quite what we would immediately imagine AUKUS Pillar 2 to be in terms of this sort of generational shift advanced technologies, I'm not quite so sure, but as something that is clearly useful and definitely should be a key focus, I think it's definitely a good news story in that respect.
Yeah, look, I agree. I really liked this story. It didn't really make much media reporting or commentary on social media, to be honest. I didn't really hear anyone talk about it. But, so the Royal Australian Navy has deployed the Navy's Maritime Geospatial Warfare Unit, MGWU, and the Maritime Deployable Robotic Autonomous Systems and Experimentation Unit to the US. They've gotten on a US-supplied vessel and conducted this as you mentioned, the integrated battle problem. The reporting says it's building on the back of exercise Autonomous Warrior conducted in
Maritime,
November.
big play.
I hate that term. I hate that term. It's a terrible term. I actually did say live on ABC that I hated that term, and somebody filmed that clip and shared that with a lot of senior people. But it is a terrible term. But anyway, look, this is a great activity. Look, I think often we gloss over AUKUS Pillar 2 and the achievements. And look, because to be honest, there hasn't been a lot out there. There was some stuff about integrating AI into the detection capabilities of P8s. There's been some other things. There haven't been any really big solid announcements. So there has been some criticism of it. Whether that's fair, I don't know. I think if you have a big breakthrough on these things, you're probably not going to be announcing it to the media. But I think this is really great. I think that seeing the three countries work on these technologies, and also I would suspect the concepts of employing these technologies for critical infrastructure protection is fantastic. I think there is a question in terms of the rate we're going at. This is a broader question in terms of how we're evolving our defence capabilities, strategies, and concepts, given the emerging challenges. And we only need to look at what's happened in Europe in the last week, which we won't talk about because that is not the nature of this podcast. But the world is changing dramatically. So there is a question about whether the efforts we're doing here are really at a rate that is going to be appropriate for the challenges to come. That said, I think this is great. I think this is a really good direction for AUKUS Pillar 2 to be moving in, especially in light of what we're seeing in Europe, as you mentioned.
Excellent. Do you want to have a talk a little bit about the Harry S. Truman incident? I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard about this, but it'd be good to get your kind of perspectives on what happened and maybe a little bit about why.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of reporting about a collision between the Truman and a merchant vessel whose name escapes me at this very second, but it also doesn't really matter. But this collision in Port Said in Egypt, which is at the northern end of the Suez Canal. Of course, it's significant because of the fact of questions about, okay, what did this mean for the Truman's capability? Thankfully, nobody was injured. You would have seen there's a lot of photos going around the internet in terms of the damage. The US is saying that the damage is predominantly superficial, that there is no impact to the Truman's operational capability. The Truman's just come off quite a long period at sea in the Red Sea, defending against the Houthis. The Houthis actually launched a number of attacks at Truman that weren't successful. Now, Truman is, there's it. It's the MV Besiktas. Panamanian flag. What a surprise. Panama has such a massive merchant fleet. So Truman's put into Suda Bay, Greece, for them to kind of assess what the damage is and what the impact might be. But the US has stressed in all their communications that there is no operational impact. And it really is kind of a cosmetic to the starboard side of Truman. So, look, this has gotten a lot of attention, to be honest. I'm not sure it's such a big deal. I know that this is not necessarily a great comment, but ships do have incidents in congested ports and anchorages. In fact, the merchant vessel that hit Truman has actually hit another merchant vessel a number of years ago. Girls, if this had impacted Truman's operational capability, a much bigger concern. What's your take?
Oh, I'm not an operator, so I'm kind of interested very much in your takes. I thought the thing where I wonder whether part of the reason why this picked up the attention it has is that there were a spate. I mean, it's been a couple of years now, but a spate of incidents in terms of the US Navy. I'm thinking about the USS Fitzgerald's collision, and then of course the collision of the Seawolf submarine in the South China Sea. I can't remember. It was I want to say the Massachusetts now, but I can't remember off the top of my head which submarine it was. But there were a number of collisions, and there was questions being raised about professionalism and these sorts of things within the United States Navy. And so I wonder whether or not that has meant that people are a little bit more kind of attuned to these kind of incidents and pick up on them in a way that perhaps they might not otherwise.
Yeah, look, potentially. I think we don't actually have enough detail about how this incident occurred to kind of equate it to that spate of incidents. I think it was 2017 where you had, in fact, in our neck of the woods, you had the collision with the John McCain and the Fitzgerald, and of course there was sadly loss of life. And I think that really kind of caused the US Navy to look at its training pipelines. Whether it's addressed that, I don't know. Certainly, I remember at the time advocating that this should be, I guess, a wake-up call to all kind of navies that have a similar training pipeline, and that really is how much do you rely on things like simulation? How much can you really qualify mariners, for example, inshore establishments, right? So I think there was a big question about that. I think we need to wait and see exactly what the details are of this collision with Truman to see whether we put it in the same boat or not. But it's part of a broader conversation, right? As navies move towards this focus on high-end warfare, what does that mean in terms of how they value and respect mariner skills, which are, equally as important? I reshared an article that I'd written last year for the 60th anniversary of the loss of Voyager, where I talked about, one of the things that we don't think about when we think about our military history is that actually every time a naval ship goes to sea, in some ways you are actually putting lives at risk because the sea can be an incredibly dangerous place, and it's very different to some of the other operations that defence does in peacetime. And I think sometimes we underestimate that.
Absolutely, it is a dangerous environment, as you all know far better than anyone else. Moving on, because we have lots to talk about. Moving on to talk a little bit about capability.
Before we go there, we've just
okay.
skipped over something important. I do think we need to give a shout out to our friends across the ditch or the ditch. I stuffed that up, so my New Zealand friends, please don't make fun of me. We might even cut this out. But Takaha has deployed to the Middle East. Now, so Takaha is one of the New Zealand's 2 Anzac-class frigates. It was commissioned in 1997. It's getting pretty old. As you can imagine, we talk about the wear and tear on Australian Anzac-class frigates for a whole bunch of reasons, one of which we just never really had enough, so we use them a lot more than we ever intended to do so. That's kind of twofold, really, in terms of when you think about the operational use of the 2 Anzac frigates the New Zealand Navy has. Look, New Zealand has deployed frigates to the Middle East before, so that's not necessarily unique, but this is the first time in a very long time, I think, that we've seen this. Now, of course, their Anzac-class frigates went through a long and challenging upgrade in Canada. They didn't select Australia, but we'll move past that. And so I think this is probably one of the first, New Zealand friends, correct me, long-range operational deployments that these Anzac class have gone. So I think it's important to acknowledge that Takaha has deployed to the Middle East, and despite the shrinking size of the New Zealand Navy's ships, they still obviously see these international deployments as pretty critical to their strategy. So I think it's worth acknowledging that.
Absolutely, and it seems like it's hopefully part of a good news story in terms of the kind of human capital within the New Zealand Navy as well, because one of the challenges they've had is that they've had the 2 Anzacs have been out of operation for so long, and they've had sort of such limited resources that they've actually been struggling with personnel. So hopefully this will then help to regenerate elements of that as well. So I think that's all in all definitely a good news story.
Right now, capability. Lots happening in capability. So I thought today we were going to focus on a couple of things that were not Australian capability announcements, although we do know that the press are talking about the excitement of a Japanese Megami visiting Darwin. I'm not sure how exciting that is, but lots of people are very excited about it. But let's focus on a little bit more capability in the region, because there's been a few interesting developments in that. What are some of those, Richard?
So we've heard there was a couple of news stories around a American laser, US Navy laser, the Helios system, which has been used and has been fitted on for trial aboard an Arleigh Burke destroyer, and which has been apparently used for the first time sometime in 2024, so we don't know quite exactly when, to effectively destroy relatively light kind of airborne targets. So this is part of a kind of a obviously directed energy weapons. We've been talking about these for a long time. I think we talked last year in this series about the Royal Navy system, and I want to now say it's called Dragonfire or Dragon's
It
Breath, and I
is. I
cannot
was
remember
about to
which
say, how
name.
did you? It's called Dragonfire. It's one of the best names for a weapon system ever. How could you forget that?
It is
Jeez.
excellent. So the RN has been making sort of moves in this regard, and this is the US Navy doing the same. This is important because of all of the conversations that we have around magazine depth and around the threat from particularly kind of low end sort of UAVs, and the discussion that there was a lot of discussion during the early part of the Red Sea troubles about the fact that you were firing very expensive missiles to shoot down very cheap drones. So directed energy weapons are seen as a really sort of important part of the puzzle going forward in terms of shipborne defences. So it's interesting to see this happening, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more detail in the future, particularly about things like range and power, because these tend to be very sort of close range weapon systems. But there's sort of obviously efforts to push that out. So yeah, really interesting one.
It is a really positive development. Now, I mean, again, a test firing doesn't equate to an operational capability in any way, shape, or form. Interesting. There is a photo that was released by I'm going to call it the Office of the Director of Operational Tests and Evaluation in the US. There is a photo of USS Preble doing this firing. Allegedly, there's also an AI-generated video going around the internet, which is a fake video. So don't watch that video. But look, I think this is good. It would be great to see this rolled out as quickly as possible. Of course, though, the challenge with directed energy weapons is, as you may have mentioned, the amount of energy required to support this system really limits the deployability on certain ships. It'd be interesting to see, what their statistics are and what their numbers are on that. Another one which I thought was an interesting mention. We talk a lot about uncrewed surface vessels on this show. It certainly is a key theme and a key trend. We haven't really talked in detail about the large optionally crewed surface vessel. I know you mentioned it last episode that there were some concerns in the US about its future. But what we do want to delve in today is that Singapore has announced this month, so in early February, that they have now operationally deployed what they're calling their MARSEC USV. So those criticising us for our acronyms, Maritime Security Uncrewed Surface Vessel. Is now operating, it looks like, in the Malacca Strait and the Strait of Singapore. Now, this vessel, it's 16.9 metres, so it is quite small. It's got a beam of about 5.2 metres. It's 30 tonnes. It can travel, apparently, in excess of 25 knots, which is interesting. In terms of what it's carrying, it's got a strobe light and a siren. It's got a searchlight. It's got an LRAD, or a long-range acoustic device, which can be quite disabling to humans on the upper decks of other ships if you want to use it. And it's got a 12.7mm stabilized weapon system and a dazzler. So I think this is really interesting. They have been operating this capability apparently since 2023 in this area, but they were crewing it because they can fit 2 people on it. This is the first time that they've really started operationally deploying it uncrewed. Now, I'm often skeptical about the role of uncrewed surface vessels in the future of naval warfare. I think they have a role. I don't think they replace surface ships. I think, clearly Ukraine has demonstrated they have a role. I do think one of the key roles is the idea of port protection or ISR and some support to constabulary operations in contested straits. So this is probably the perfect kind of vessel and the perfect area to be testing out this concept. So it'd be interesting to see how successful it is. What's your take on the Singaporean news of this operational capability?
Yeah, so it's something I've been tracking for a little while, and I'm really interested in it because I do, in part, I agree with you about the potential here, and I would suggest and kind of focus on the fact that they are particularly applicable for a kind of a Singaporean maritime security approach. That Singapore has obviously incredibly congested sort of waters surrounding it, but it's also relatively confined and small. So very different, for example, to trying to police the Australian EEZ. But I think there are still some real questions and things that I hope will sort of get a little bit more visibility on. Things like what actually is it that this can do and what can it not do? So obviously it can't board a vessel. It is armed, but I'm really intrigued to know what kind of rules of engagement or anything like that there might be, and what kind of scenario could it actually deploy a weapon. So really interesting capability. The Singaporeans are some of the only ones I know who are pushing this kind of maritime security lower end element of USVs, apart from the ISR role. So obviously things like Blue Bottle and Sail Drone, it's all about understanding the maritime domain. This is something rather more kind of focused in terms of actually policing. And so they've been pushing this envelope. But I think there are some then questions about, well, how does that actually work when the rubber hits the road? And so hopefully we'll get a bit more insight into that into the future. But really interesting that they've decided that it's kind of ready to go in a fully uncrewed format.
Yeah, absolutely. We should say they're calling it autonomous. There's no way that weapon system is autonomous. It'll be remotely controlled. But I think the point is the navigation system on it is autonomous.
Yep.
And then finally, I guess before we go to the big did you know, which is an exciting did you know, I'm really excited about it because this is something that I often talk about. Many naval officers do. Before we get to that, though, it is worth noting that the head of the Philippines military, in a meeting the last week, kind of re-emphasized the aspiration of the Philippine Navy to acquire submarines. So this has been a discussion for quite a while now. There really hasn't been any concrete plans. In this meeting, he said that they would likely acquire 2 submarines. Now, I've seen some people say, that's great. That's a kind of crawl, walk, run approach. I would argue that 2 submarines is difficult to argue as an operational capability, and you only need to look at the Malaysian experience of how challenging it was to operate their 2 submarines and sustain them and train for etc. You need to have some degree of critical mass for a capability. There's some discussion out there that the front runners for supplying these submarines are, of course, the French, who have been trying to push submarines across both Southeast Asia and Central America after their unsuccessful bid in Australia. But who knows? I mean, there is some Australian commentators saying that that's the direction we're going to go in. I find that highly unlikely. But also the South Koreans, whether they are a contender for this as well, who have been, increasing their exports of naval capabilities. So, look, no real change there, but I think it just re-emphasizes the aspiration of the Philippines to be operating submarines in the region.
Yep. Aspirations would be my one word there. Let's see. But certainly interesting that the proliferation or proliferation certainly of interest of submarines across Southeast Asia and efforts to deploy them. But yeah, I'll leave it on the tone of slight skepticism.
Fair enough. All right. Did you know? So we are bringing back the did you know. We were neglectful last episode. But what do you know, Richard?
So we're going to be talking about Ratcatchers and Regulators. These are 2 kind of classes of, or sort of divides, groups that are sometimes sort of described in terms of military officers. And in particular, this was sort of famously drawn out in a book by a guy called Andrew Gordon, talking about the Battle of Jutland and why it was sort of the controversy around it, and perhaps why it was that the Royal Navy, the Grand Fleet, didn't win the Battle of Jutland. And this has been one of the kind of the great debates initially within the Royal Navy and then among naval historians for years afterwards. And you can see 2 very different kind of styles and approaches in terms of naval officers which come through in the history of the battle. I'm not going to talk at length about the history of the battle because I'll take up all of the time. But you have the kind of overall British Grand Fleet commander, Admiral John Jellicoe, who is very much a regulator. Regulators are officers who are very much kind of by the book. There is often an argument that these people come through the kind of the bureaucratic process side of militaries. Again, one of the things particularly is drawn out talking about this more broadly in terms of other military officers is that they often spend quite a lot of time in things like acquisition, and they're very process driven and kind of quite hierarchical. Whereas your Ratcatchers, in Royal Navy terms, these are your old sort of sort horses, the people who want to go out there, get the job done. The idea is going out there and basically trying to destroy the enemy. And in that role, the kind of, I guess, the archetype from this case study is Admiral David Beatty, who was commander of the battlecruiser element of the British fleet. And so there is this debate, and there was a huge debate after the war about whether or not either David Beatty was far too gung-ho, and he lost quite a lot of his ships. The battle cruisers took quite a pounding, basically because he was extremely aggressive and went out and tried to destroy the German battle cruisers and ended up running smack bang into the main German fleet. And so those who critique the kind of the Ratcatchers often see Beatty and some of the things that Beatty did were not necessarily very, he didn't always follow process. So lots of his communications weren't great. His signaling was poor because he was very much focused on basically, I'm going to lead, you follow me, you come after me, and we're basically going to do everything to sort of engage the enemy. A little bit of the Nelson engage the enemy more closely side of things. Whereas those who critique Jellicoe say that he missed a lot of opportunities to annihilate the German fleet. He had the main overwhelming force of the British Grand Fleet, but he did everything kind of by the book. He never took any risks. He didn't give his commanders a huge amount of kind of rope in many ways. Everyone had their role and they were expected to fill it. And so even when opportunities were presented to sort of some of his subordinates at various points, they didn't take those opportunities because they felt that they were constrained within a very clear kind of system. And so this debate goes on. There is no right answer. I must say I'm more on the Jellicoe side of things, of Jellicoe being very much a regulator. And I think if you read some of James Goldrick's stuff talking about command and the challenges that Jellicoe was facing in terms of command at that point, he was commanding a huge fleet of 250 vessels with limited communication, trying to work out precisely where everyone was. This was an age before GPS. So even if you were in perfect comms with somebody, they didn't know where they were and you didn't know precisely where you were. So where you were in relation to each other was extremely difficult to work out. So a lot of challenges there in terms of that was why he felt we needed a very kind of process-driven, structured approach. But I think you can play this out more broadly, and the one example which I would pull out where I think you really do see the kind of the failure of the regulators versus the Ratcatchers actually is if you look in the Second World War in the US submarine force, which was deployed into our region. And a lot of these submarines in late 1941 and early 1942 got themselves into some excellent positions and very rarely actually managed to achieve any results. Now, part of that was due to failures in terms of torpedoes and their technology, but a lot of it was due to the fact that basically the commanders were nowhere near aggressive enough. And so they've been brought up in this peacetime system where you don't take huge amounts of risks. It often takes a bit longer for you to get to command, so people are a bit older, and they've been through and sort of embedded in this bureaucratic process. And actually, it took time for the US Navy basically to get rid of a lot of those COs replaced them with younger, far more aggressive commanders. And it was those who went on to do a lot of the damage in the latter part of the Second World War. And they were very much of the kind of the Ratcatcher mold of sort of, as long as you're going out there and sinking the enemy, then you're doing your job, and everything else can go out the window. But it's a really interesting divide, and I think you can see it play out across militaries more generally, and I suspect it will be something that will be interesting to think about in terms of the ADF, and whether or not we're forcing people to be too process-driven, and whether or not we have enough rat catchers, and how you sort of balance those two things out.
No, thanks, Richard. Look, I think it's a really interesting discussion point, right? There's lots of examples, and in fact, we mentioned before the incidents with USS Fitzgerald and McCain in 2017, and actually some of the commentary around that time was kind of in this vein of what kind of attributes do you want, in this context in your naval officers, but you can scale it to military officers more generally. I think it's interesting too because it resonates with a conversation. I recently did a book review of 21st Century Mahan for the Australian Army Research Centre. You can get the review on their website. And I've always written off Mahan, to be honest. I'm not a fan, much to my PhD supervisor, Dr. Jack McCaffrey's, or Commodore Jack McCaffrey's disgust. But actually, this book kind of brought to attention an essay that Mahan had written in the mid-1890s, I think, around the idea of naval bureaucracies and the balance that needs to be set, because when the naval bureaucracy takes control, it actually disables that warfighting capability, right? And I think there's a real question for like-minded navies. I hate the term Western navies, but like-minded navies kind of our naval tradition of what era are we in now, and what structure and what attributes do we need?
Absolutely, and I think you can look across different eras and different times, and you can see these characteristics sort of popping out in various ways. So, yeah, really interesting one. That is all we have time for. So we're going to say, as ever, that maritime matters. Thank you for listening, and thank you for the chat, Jen, and we'll be back again hopefully next week.